He's the former president and publisher of the Sun Herald, and now he's on the radio. Welcome to Coast View with Ricky Mathews on SuperTalk Mississippi Gulf Coast 103.1.
Welcome back to Coast View. I've really been looking forward to this next segment with Julian Rankin, the executive director of the Walter Anderson Museum of Art. He's really celebrated. When he was hired, he started in October 2018 to work there. The board was truly excited about having him join. And after you hear this conversation with Julian, I think you'll understand why. Julian, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. It's good to be with you.
So from your home studio, you have a wonderful podcast you do. I think you're six editions into it. Is that right?
Yeah, we started a show called The Connect, where we wanted to use the museum platform to connect people to different ideas and landscapes all across the region. So we're having a good time with it.
Yeah, I've watched several of them, and they're really good. I love the approach that you're taking, and it really connects to the strategic planning that you guys did, where you're really wanting to understand the role the Walter Anderson Museum plays across all sectors of life, whether it be business or whatever, nonprofit community, the tourism community. You've really understood what it takes to hit on all cylinders, and communication is obviously a big part of that. I look forward to talking to you about that. So let's do this, just so people have an appreciation for the Walter Anderson Museum. We're going to dive deeply into Walter Anderson's life. What an interesting man he was. Yeah, I think some people see him as sort of this recluse that used to row his boat to Horn Island and live on Horn Island. Well, that's true. I think some would be surprised that he traveled the world, to Europe and all over the United States and South America and Asia. And he was well educated and ultimately incredibly talented, very prolific. But we'll get into all that as we get into this conversation. But why don't you tell us first about the museum, where it is, and from your perspective, very high level, the significance of the museum.
Sure. Well, we are in downtown Ocean Springs. The museum has been here since 1991 when it was founded. But of course, for those who live here and know about Walter Anderson, the legacy has been there long before. And the community center, the Ocean Springs Community Center, which is his 3,000 square feet of murals that has been there since the 50s, that's attached to the museum. And so when the museum was built, that was part of the architecture and the soul of that building. And we're an integral part of so many facets of the community, but certainly tourism being a big piece of that. And as you said, when we started a new strategic planning process and put that into the practice when I came on board, it was really about connecting these oft siloed fields of study and sectors, from business and tourism to science and marine education. And so we feel like we're doing a really good job of paying homage to what Walter Anderson captured in his art, which was about interconnection, and doing so in the modern landscape and in the 21st century. And we really are looking forward to continue to expand that work with all these different partners we work with.
He had an amazing life. One of many quotes that he had, this was from his Horn Island logs: "The miracle of realizing that art and nature are literally one thing astonishes me each time it happens." That was Walter Anderson from his Horn Island logs. He did get it, though, didn't he? That life was about connecting, and this experience of connecting. Even when he did his art, I read that he would often just set it aside and move on to the next piece, because it was the process of, just immersing himself in a project that he enjoyed the most. Isn't that true?
Yeah, and his work really is experiential, and that's a word that his family, especially John Anderson, Walter Anderson's son, often leans on, that experiential quality of his work. Because especially when you think about the Horn Island watercolors, which were not really discovered in their full totality until after Walter Anderson died in 1965, those were made on humble typing paper, 8.5 by 11 sheets, and many of them made on Horn Island, and they were not made as products themselves. They were not intended to be sold or even to be in museums. They were made to literally find that connection, that moment of transcendence where Walter Anderson felt like he was seeing kind of another reality, and many of those, of course, were on Horn Island, which is in itself another reality. And when I came on board, the first thing I did actually before I even came into the office was camped out on Horn Island to try to get that experience. And I've since gone back, but you really have to walk in his footsteps a bit to truly appreciate what he was doing.
I think, you're talking about they weren't discovered until after he had passed. Can't help but think about George Orr and how he was discovered as a potter, and then Robert Johnson, the blues guitarist and singer. He wasn't discovered for like 40 years after he passed away. I wonder what Walter Anderson would have thought about his notoriety today. Have you thought about that?
We do think about that. It's interesting because we have to speak on behalf of Walter Anderson to a certain degree, and we can't really know what he would have thought and felt about this modern world we live in. But I think he probably had an inkling that when he was gone, his work would be discovered. I think during his lifetime, it was not the most important thing to him. Fame, he shirked the spotlight. He didn't seek that out, but he probably had an awareness that what he was doing was important, and I think he left that for the for the generations to come to figure out. His family, who did such a great job stewarding the work, and then when the museum came online, we feel like our role is really to honor that, and I think he would be proud. I just think a part of him probably didn't want to be around when the fame came.
That recluse part of him probably wouldn't have enjoyed it. But it is interesting that what you say, that maybe he realized that what he was doing about how to connect sort of the human experience with nature and the way that it manifested itself in so many different ways through carving and painting and sketching and writing, that it would somehow become really important. I tripped across that YouTube video of his wife Sissy doing a tour of his work area, and this eclectic collection of things. The paint, the murals, of course, are a very significant part of that. But the carvings he did and the various collections from Horn Island that he had picked up over the years. And man, you wish you could just sit and talk with him today, don't you? Just to learn from him.
I know, and a lot of people don't realize the scope of work that he did. He was a muralist. We know the murals. Many people know him almost exclusively because of the block prints, and he made those, of course, as products to share art widely with people who didn't have a lot of money, but still, as he said, had an appetite for beauty. And so he made those, but he also made furniture and carvings, and he was a poet and a writer, and so many different elements to his work that it really takes a long time to tease them all out. But we feel like the museum does a really great job of encapsulating that full story, and it's really what equips us to do a lot of the educational work we do, because he did leave so many pathways open for us.
So you grew up in Shaw, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. Your dad taught at Delta State, and then he moved to Ole Miss, and so you lived for some time in Oxford. Then you were in North Carolina. You worked in Jackson, but because of your life's path and the work that you did in Jackson, you have a really good perspective on art in Mississippi. And one of the things you said to me offline that I thought was really important, you said you understood the role that the land played in our external environment that we have such a wonderful opportunity to enjoy here in coastal Mississippi. Tell us, what do you mean by that? Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think the southern land is a lens for people to understand what it means to be American, and certainly human in a lot of ways. I mean, even the Mississippi River, the namesake for this state, is such a large force in this country. And Walter Anderson had a great quote, actually. He was on a canoe trip in the 1930s down the Mississippi River with his wife. And as she writes, he dipped his hat into the river to get a drink of water. And he called that water a distillation of America. So all these things, and that's physically a distillation, as we know, all of the tributaries that flow into the river and then down here to the Gulf of Mexico, we see that physical effect, but also there's a symbolic message to that so much of America's heart and soul lies in the heartland. And so that's with the river, but it's also the Mississippi Delta, which has been called the most southern place on earth. And so whether you're talking about industry or history or civil rights. There's so much there, and I think that continues when you look at the environment. In other words, the flora and fauna of the coast and of all the places here in Mississippi. We're fundamentally a rural state, so we have such experience over the generations with being close to the land, and the land can teach us a lot. It holds this wisdom that if you just go out and seek it, then you find really important messages and things that'll strengthen us, we think, even in a very technologically centered world.
I think that's one of the reasons why the Walter Anderson Museum and its connection to the environment, places like Horn Island, for example, you mentioned, and the ability to be able to go there and see that treasure, but to really experience in all of its grandeur and the way that Walter Anderson tried to convey that to us through his art. And then things like the Blues Trail. I mean, if you think about, the evolution of the Blues Trail in Mississippi, what an incredible gem that is, to be able to understand the source of blues and where it came from and the pain it was conveying. Someone I interviewed recently said, how can such a sad song make you feel so good at the end? Just an incredible evolution in this state. Let's do this. We'll come back after this break and continue the conversation of the significance of art and culture in Mississippi, how Ora Museum how the Walter Anderson Museum, the Ora Museum, Peter Anderson, all these pieces of coastal Mississippi fit into all of that. This is Julian Rankin, the executive director from the Walter Anderson Museum of Art. We'll be back after this break.
Listen live or on demand and watch episodes of Coast View on your laptop, desktop, or on your phone or tablet by going to SuperTalk MSGulfCoast.com.
Talking to the people that help make the coast such a unique place to live. This is Coast View with Ricky Mathews on SuperTalk Mississippi Gulf Coast 103.1.
Welcome back to Coast View. We have Julian Rankin with us today. He's the executive director for the Walter Anderson Museum of Art. Julian, one of the things I think when people think of art or museums, they think of some kind of uppity something. It's for educated rich people. And that is actually completely counter to what Walter Anderson wanted to accomplish. He actually wanted to be able to share his passion for nature and art to the average person. Let's talk about why that's so important. Talk about that to begin with.
Yeah, well, I think even if you look at his biography, he was about democratizing the creative process and the actual art products that he wanted people to be able to afford. But even if you look at his 1920s travels, he went to France in 1927 after getting a fellowship from his college in Philadelphia. And when he was over there, he did stop by the museums, but he was really less interested in the institutions, and he wanted to see the cave paintings. And so he went to these 20,000-year-old cave compounds, these complexes where prehistoric humans had made these most early marks and these artworks that stood the test of time. And that was when he knew he wanted to be a muralist. So if you think about that as a vehicle, he's talking about just people picking up dyes and finding things from nature to express themselves. And that was what he clung to. So I think when people think about art museums, there naturally is a history, especially in America and in the West, of it being elite, an institution that is not as accessible. But I think for us and a lot of museums nowadays, that's not at all what it's about. We do preserve artworks, but it's not just about putting something on a wall. It's about taking those messages and giving it back to the people and hopefully empowering folks to look around them and inside themselves and figure out what they can do, what they can create, not just as artists, but just as thinkers, as business owners, as family members, as people. And so we try to do a lot of that. And in Mississippi, it's a prime place to do it because you do have this history, like you mentioned with the blues, of people creating things with what they had and beautiful things that have stood the test of time and that have made Mississippi, per capita, one of the most diverse and richest well springs of creativity that Earth has ever produced.
It's interesting that Walter Anderson found himself in France in the 1920s. I couldn't help but think of A Movable Feast, the book that was published posthumously of Ernest Hemingway's life about his time in Paris during that time when so much creativity, whether it be literature or art or whatever, what an influential moment for him to have passed through there.
Yeah, it's true. And you think about, I mean, even talking about the words, of feast, you think about the food too, the culinary art that exists around us today and also in the South. These are moments, kind of ephemeral moments that they don't last forever. Creativity is not just meant to be a product that exists and is there forever. It's meant to be an experience that people have with one another. And you really can see it in Walter Anderson's work and in a lot of the partners that we try to work with too. You see this in students and in chefs and in other communities who have their own traditions of creating things. And so we really like to kind of blow the definition of art out of the water and make it not about fine art or folk art. It's just about creative expression, and that contains everything.
Yeah, I love the way Walter Anderson talked about finding the fountain of youth. When you see the connection and the realization of, we're all in this together, this amazing outside world that we have this honor of living in. Hey, this is part one of our conversation. Part two for the radio audience is going to hear the second part next week. The Facebook audience will be able to see it all at one time. But why don't we do this? I want to shift gears slightly and just say, what's the status of the museum today? So we can get that in the first part in case somebody, don't get the opportunity to see the second half of this. What are you guys up to right now in this COVID environment?
Well, certainly we're responding as everyone is, where we're taking orders and advice from health professionals and our state and local officials. So the museum is not open currently to the public. We're still under the Safer at Home order guidelines that last for a few more weeks here, and we are preparing for reopening. So we don't have a definitive date, but we are going to start moving and transitioning back to working at the museum here in the weeks to come, and then preparing for a safer and slightly different experience for the public, so that this summer when people come back to the museum, there'll be new exhibitions for them to see, but they'll also feel safe being there. And, this has been a challenge for all sectors of life and business, obviously to have such a dramatic disruption and all this uncertainty. But we've also tried to look at it as a chance to innovate and grow our own capacities, whether that's a digital capacity, which we alluded to earlier. We're doing a lot of digital engagement, but also just thinking about what the future of our museum is to facilitating what's going to need to be a recovery for the coast. And so we're thrilled to be such an important part of the coast, but we also know that there's a lot of work to do. And so we're on call to be part of that recovery and continue to bring inspiration to people.
So we're coming to the end of this segment, but one thing that's so important, and you guys will play a role in this, but the outside world needs to see coastal Mississippi as a safe place to visit. And so as everyone, whether you're a casino, a restaurant, a museum, or whoever, the average person, when people come here, they need to feel that we get it and that we're a safe place to visit, because we're tourism's number 2 industry in coastal Mississippi. And the Walter Anderson Museum will play its part in sending that message to the world, because an outbreak, if we do get an outbreak here, it could set us back, and we don't want to get set back. So anyway, this has been Julian Rankin, the executive director of the Walter Anderson Museum of Art, and we'll come back to him next week in part 2. So thank you for joining us, Julian.
Thank you.
You can also listen live to SuperTalk Mississippi Gulf Coast 103.1 on your Amazon Alexa devices. Once you've enabled the skill, just say, "Alexa, open SuperTalk Mississippi Gulf Coast."